Zelda fans all know that grief, death, and mortality are all themes inherent to the Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, but something that I don't think gets enough attention is just how pervasive and human Skull Kid's isolation and loneliness truly is. Hi, my name's John. And for those of you who aren't familiar, I'm working on getting my master's degree in clinical mental health counseling. And so today, I'm going to be taking a look at my all-time favorite character from the Legend of Zelda franchise, and that's Skull Kid. So if you like this kind of content, you want to see more of it coming from this channel, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and why not even ring that notification bell so you never miss another upload. And make sure to share this video wherever you like sharing things. But with all that out of the way, let's just jump into the video. Now, if we're going to look into the mind of Skull Kid, we first need to understand where he comes from and what he actually is. In Ocarina of Time, we get hints here and there that children who lose themselves in the Lost Woods eventually become Skull Kids, and so this is the assumption that we're going to operate under moving forward, that Skull Kids are quite literally lost children who have been twisted by the Lost Woods to become what they are now. But we can infer from Anju's grandmother that the Skull Kid we know from Majora's Mask was actually a resident of Termina way before the events of Majora's Mask ever occurred. Essentially, Skull Kid was friends with the four giants before the world of Termina was split into separate regions, but on the day of the Carnival of Time, the giants revealed to the people they would take it upon themselves to protect everyone while they slept. Now, this story is incredibly important when talking about the psychology of Skull Kid because of the fact that he was friends with those four giants, and so hearing that they were going to the four corners of Termina was devastating for him. And I think it goes without saying that he didn't take it too well. Now, with the giants having seemingly abandoned Skull Kid to become the guardians of Termina, essentially becoming godlike figures, I think that we need to look at how losing such important bonds could affect Skull Kid in the long run. And to do so, we need to look at the core function that drives all of Skull Kid's behavior throughout the course of the game, and that's his loneliness. After he was abandoned by his longtime friends, Skull Kid was understandably really upset about this loss. So how do you think that an individual with the mentality of a child with no real support system and likely no experience with practicing healthy coping mechanisms would react to a loss like this? In short, probably not well. Anju's grandmother explains to us that Skull Kid repeatedly displaced his frustrations by playing tricks on the citizens of Termina. Now, while this may seem pretty on brand and easily dismissible for a Skull Kid, if we really think about the context of his situation, this tells us a lot about how Skull Kid has learned to deal with his problems. If we look at the practices of applied behavior analysis therapy, an evidence-based approach used to help determine and alter maladaptive behaviors for a wide variety of individuals and environments, we will see that there are four core underlying functions of all of our behavior, which include automatic reinforcement, or when an individual does something specifically because it feels good; escape, which is when a behavior is meant to avoid doing something the individual doesn't want to do; access to attention, which is to get the attention from parents, teachers, peers, or really anyone else around them, whether it's positive or negative; and finally, access to intangibles, which is exactly what it sounds like, working to get an item they want or to be able to be involved in an activity they're interested in. And so with these four functions of behavior in mind, I think it's pretty safe to say that the function of Skull Kid's behavior was to get attention, no matter how negative, from both the residents of Termina, and more importantly, from his former friends, the Giants. It stands to reason that the loss of these friends drove Skull Kid to not only displace his grief and his frustration with the Giants' decision to leave him onto innocent citizens, but it also was to serve his need for attention with this negative attention-seeking behavior. He knew for a fact that the Giants would only sleep until the residents of Termina were so distressed that they had to call out to them, and so he, whether consciously or not, probably drove the citizens of Termina to the point that they could no longer tolerate him and needed to turn to the Giants for help. So in the end, he got what he likely wanted, but his former friends threatened to rip him apart if he didn't leave the residence of Termina be, which ultimately led to Skull Kid parting from the land he once called home, leaving him to grieve alone. Now, I think it's important before we move any further to address why being left alone was likely so upsetting for Skull Kid. And to do that, we need to revisit how an individual becomes a Skull Kid. Like I'd mentioned earlier, a child must lose themselves in the Lost Woods to become a Skull Kid. Imagine the pure fear and loneliness that a child must endure as they're slowly being transformed by the forest into a Skull Kid. It's a fate that I wouldn't wish upon literally anyone. But eventually, after who knows how long, Skull Kid was able to make friends with the giants in the land of Termina, likely regaining a sense of belonging and mediating these feelings of fear and loneliness. So when it felt as though this belonging and friendship was being unfairly taken away from him once more, that's when these attention-seeking behaviors manifested in conjunction with the displacement of his frustrations. But ultimately, as we saw, it landed him right back where he started. Banished from his new home by his former friends, alone again in the woods, scared and not knowing what to do next. So after another undisclosed amount of time, we learn that Tattle and Tail find Skull Kid cold and sheltering from the rain, seemingly having found his way back to Termina. And after some consideration, they all huddled together in the cold and the rain. From this point forward, they became friends. Skull Kid once again had some semblance of support in his life, but even still, this is when everything starts to go wrong. Now, before we get any further, I think that we need to talk for a moment about morality in childhood, because I think that this will give us an incredible amount of additional insight into why Skull Kid makes the choices that he does. According to Lawrence Kohlberg, there are 6 core stages of moral development in which the individual's primary motivation for moral behavior is either avoiding punishment, self-interest, to have a good boy or good girl attitude, law and order, the social contract, and finally, based on their own personal principles at the highest level. And while we could talk endlessly about each and every one of these stages, the one that I want to focus on in particular while talking about Skull Kid is stage 2, or the self-interest stage. This stage of moral development is most prevalent by far within younger children, though it can carry all the way through adulthood for some individuals, and it's characterized by an individual approaching moral situations with a mindset of what's in it for me. And they will make the choice that they believe to be in their best interests. In essence, the needs of others could very well be put on the back burner so that their own needs can be met. Now, I don't know about you, but I feel as though this illustrates Skull Kid to a T when we meet him. And I need to stress that pretty much everyone will go through this stage at some point in their lives, and it's completely normal, especially for children. Typically, this is mediated by providing the child with reinforcements and incentives to act in an appropriate manner. But Skull Kid didn't have that. He was alone, and so he followed his impulses and did what he wanted because he wanted to. And the best example of this by far was when he assaulted the Happy Mask salesman in the woods. The moment that Skull Kid assaulted the Happy Mask salesman was the moment that became the linchpin for the entire plot of Majora's Mask. In line with Kohlberg's theory, Skull Kid likely saw that the mask salesman had something that he wanted and therefore didn't consider the implications his actions could have on his victim. He saw that if he could knock out the traveling salesman, then he had everything to gain and nothing to lose. And so with the help of Tattle and Tail, who by not stopping him instead reinforced the behavior, he did just that. They knocked the salesman out, and all that Skull Kid took was one singular mask. And this simple action would send Skull Kid down a very dark, complicated, and interesting road. And as Skull Kid dons the iconic Majora's Mask, we are finally able to see the mechanisms of Skull Kid's inner world, but they are cranked up to 12 as the mask distorts his mind. According to the Hyrule Encyclopedia, the Termina that we visit is a land that has been created by the melding of the Mask's evil and the Skull Kid's delusions, meaning that everything that we see has been in part shaped by Skull Kid's mind. It's mind-boggling to think that this happens because when we're looking at attention-seeking behavior in children, we'll find that if this behavior doesn't work, then they will shift to control-seeking behavior, which is exactly what it sounds like. When a child doesn't feel as though they have their own personal sense of power or control, this is when they begin looking to take control over the environment around them. It's little wonder that when granted the power of Majora's Mask, this led Skull Kid, whether intentionally or not, to creating his own twisted version of Termina, which happens to be the one that we explore as Link. And while I know that many people regard Termina being a creation of Majora and Skull Kid to be a retcon by Nintendo, I think that it actually makes a lot of sense from the perspective of Skull Kid in the story. I mean, let's think about it. The game takes place exclusively during the Carnival of Time, which once we reach the end of the third day, this is when the world is destroyed by Skull Kid dropping the moon on Termina. I believe that since we are residing in a world created by Skull Kid's psyche, this makes a lot of sense because it was the Carnival of Time that he believed that his friends, the giants, abandoned him, which in essence could be seen as when his personal internal world ended. And so if he's trying to take back control of his environment, instead of his world ending because the giants abandoned him at the festival, now he is going to end the world of everyone else he once knew and who shunned him, so that they can see that the giants who abandoned him won't save them either, so they too can feel the helplessness and loneliness that he did. Now, the elephant in the room that I suppose we need to address is the fact that the only thing present in Termina that was not created by Skull Kid or the Mask is Link. If Termina is quite literally a manifestation of Skull Kid's delusions, like Nintendo says in the Hyrule Encyclopedia, then Link takes on a very similar role to the Phantom Thieves in Persona 5 Royal, or Raz from Psychonauts. As Link travels through the land of Termina, he is directly experiencing and witnessing everything that Skull Kid has bottled up. And I think that the thing that so many people have already picked up on and analyzed to heck and back is Link moving through the 5 stages of grief, which were first proposed by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in her 1969 book on death and dying. The 5 stages, according to Kubler-Ross, are denial and isolation, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. I think it would be easy to see this as an overarching theme within the world itself, but I believe that as we move through the game, we are helping Skull Kid work through his grief. As Kubler-Ross puts it, throughout each stage of grief, a common thread of hope emerges, and within Skull Kid and Majora's Termina, that hope is Link. Whether he is facing the denial of the townspeople that anything is wrong in the first place, the isolation that many of them like Kafei feel in this perpetual carnival, the anger of King Deku surrounding losing his daughter, Darmani bargaining for his life back, the depression that Lulu feels after losing her eggs, and finally the acceptance within the Stone Tower Temple in which many of its denizens have accepted their fate. In each of these areas, Link is the ray of hope that helps the citizens of Termina to cope with what they are struggling with. And if we are operating under the assumption that these are all manifestations of Skull Kid's mind, he is in turn helping Skull Kid to resolve the grief surrounding the isolation he feels after having been banished by his friends. It's easy to pinpoint death as a major theme in Majora's Mask, but I think that a theme that is all the more encompassing of every character in the game is loss. Whether it is through death, a curse, kidnapping, theft, or however else it may have occurred, so many people that you interact with in Termina are dealing with loss in some way, shape, or form, and Link is there to help them through it. And all of this leads to him once he has recruited the 4 giants to reach the moon, which can be seen as the heart of all of Skull Kid's problems, or the heart of the distortion. It's funny that it's the moon that represents this too, because when I think of the moon, I think of something intangible, something so large that I would have no way whatsoever to stop it even if I tried. And as we enter the moon, we see 4 children playing and one sitting alone with his head down beneath a tree. And this is the unstoppable weight of the world that Skull Kid is dealing with. The moon in this made-up world is a physical manifestation of the loneliness Skull Kid feels every day without his friends, something that he can't stop or hold up on his own. But by working through Skull Kid's grief throughout the course of the game, by helping every citizen of Termina, Link is able to not only stop the moon from crashing with the help of the giants, but he is also able to stop the crushing weight of loneliness from overtaking Skull Kid. The final battle is fascinatingly symbolic, because if you help everyone complete all of the side quests in the game, therefore receiving every mask, you are able to trade these masks in this paradise within the moon to utilize the fierce deity mask in your final confrontation, with Majora quickly getting rid of Skull Kid to fight you on its own. I think that masks are such a great narrative device within this battle because according to Jungian psychology, a person's mask, or their persona as Jung puts it, is what they use to shield themselves from the world, as these proverbial masks are how we present ourselves to the outside world and other people, though they don't necessarily represent our true selves. The citizens of Termina saw Skull Kid as a blight on their world, and so they called the giants to get rid of him. And so Majora's Mask, in essence, became a representation of this persona, but this is not who Skull Kid truly is. So you, as Link, must destroy the manifestation of Skull Kid's demons and who he presents himself to the world as once and for all. I think it's poetic that the Song of Healing is so prevalent within this game, because as we move through the physical manifestation of Skull Kid's mind, it shows that all Skull Kid truly needed was the help of someone who cares, like Link. Skull Kid's grief surrounding losing his friends and his isolation had consumed his mind, and all he needed was someone to truly support him and help him to work through his grief. And in essence, this is what Link's journey represented. The focal point of this game is and always has been Skull Kid, and so it's only fitting that our last conversation with him is him realizing that the giants never truly forgot him, and that maybe he isn't so alone after all. And so we're left with Skull Kid finally being able to live not as the hated, lonely imp, but as someone with true friends. And because he is now truly happy, we see that the Termina that is the manifestation of his mind, and everyone in it, are truly happy as well. But that will do it for today's video, guys, and I want to pass the question off to you. Do you agree with my thoughts on Skull Kid's psychology and his effects on the world of Termina, or do you have some disagreements here or there? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comment section down below, and while you're down there, why not liking the video, subscribing, and how about even ringing that notification bell so you never miss another upload. And make sure to share this video wherever you like sharing things. It's always so appreciated. But as always, I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day, a fantastic rest of your week, and why not even a fantastic rest of your month. And I will see you in the next video. Later.